thank you for joining us for celebrating the 20th anniversary of the not-so-new New Labor Forum. Yeah. The fact that we've been able to maintain ourselves here for this long, and for any of you familiar with the life of journals, this is a very long life that we've led so far. It really has been the result of the efforts of many people, and I want to try to just do a little gratitude here. The moral and political backing, as well as the carrying the water for many years by Greg Mancios, director of the Institute, is a big reason that we're here. And part of that political backing is the result of our labor advisory board of 20 unions here in New York, who have given their full support to the Institute and its programs. In addition, our editorial board that provides our kind of editorial compass, a number of editorial board members are here with us this evening. And then the consulting editors, a number of them also here. The day-to-day work of the journal benefits immeasurably from the skill and the intelligence of Steve Fraser, editor-at-large, not able to be with us tonight, and also managing editor Andrea Solonik, book reviews editor Gabe Wynant, and editorial associate Karen Judd. It's really, though, the work of our brilliant and committed authors that we work in service of, getting their ideas, their arguments, their research into print as clearly as we can. We are at their service, and many of them are here also tonight. And everybody who will be speaking tonight is among them. Also, thank you to Samantha Valente and to Veronica Ordaz, without whom this evening would not be possible. The conditions in which we find ourselves today seem a far cry from those that gave birth to the journal 20 years ago. In the journal's inaugural editorial statement back in 1997, we declared, "This is a time of hope," a mood that felt palpable among labor activists way back then. In the wake of the AFL-CIO's first ever contested elections in 1995, the New Voice leadership at the Federation had proclaimed its commitment to large-scale organizing and to building ambitious coalition building with social justice organizations that had also been in decline, but without whom a broader social justice movement wouldn't be possible. At that time, organized labor began to engage in a rapprochement with left intellectuals and political activists who had for decades been excluded from the AFL-CIO. All these efforts also gave rise to the widespread hopes that organized labor might fuel a broader movement for social and economic justice. Some political activists in and around the labor movement had begun to form the New Party, others Labor Party, others working hard to push the Democratic Party to the left. At that time, all of those options seemed conceivable and worthy of debate. And each of those options was the subject of an article in the very first issue of New Labor Forum back in 1997. Even in those days, though, there was a keen sense that the revitalization of the labor movement and a building of working class power would be a tough row to hoe. In that same editorial statement of 1997, we acknowledged the journal is both a response to this new optimism and a recognition that difficulties lie ahead. And as it turns out, that was a massive understatement. 2 months before the first issue of New Labor Forum went to press, welfare reform had also gone to press, so to speak, kicking 6.5 million people off of public assistance. 2 decades into the war on drugs, and a few years after the passage of 3 strikes laws, well over 1 million Black and Latino men were in the grips of our criminal injustice system, greatly exacerbating the urgencies that confronted social justice activists and communities of color. Walmart had come to hold sway over a vast global supply chain of sweated manufacturing, shipping, warehousing, and low-wage retail work. The financialization of the domestic and global economies were in full throttle. And as inequalities were rising, journalists and scholars had begun to announce a second Gilded Age. These were some of the challenges we faced in the mid-90s, way back when the Donald was a mere real estate huckster and a buffoonish fixture on the New York social scene. Naturally, these challenges, as well as the multiple causes for hope swirling around the labor and allied movements, became the focus of New Labor Forum. On this occasion, it seems worthwhile to review the range of issues that have troubled and excited and vexed activists and intellectuals in and around labor and allied movements, and therefore found a place in the journal. On the domestic side, the issues have included the dramatic growth of low-wage service and precarious work, the decline of manufacturing, the privatization of public education, immigration raids and super exploitation of immigrant workers, burgeoning rates of incarceration, women workers, feminism and the labor movement, the movement for LGBTQ rights, the decline of strikes, the rise of union busting, debates about race and class, about union democracy and union structure, labor's marriage to the Democratic Party, labor's relationship to the American empire and wars without end, 2 waves of healthcare reform, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the climate change crisis. Internationally, contributors to the journal have examined the promise and dashed hopes of labor and social justice activists in post-apartheid South Africa, the rise and fall of the pink tide in Latin America, efforts to organize among informal workers throughout the global South, and recently the rise of economic nationalism throughout Europe. From the very beginning, a commitment to the labor question writ large was our commitment. Our articles would debate and discuss issues raised within the House of Labor, but we also sought to publish pieces that would go out to the yard, where flowers were growing in the form of poetry, music, and art by and about the working class in all its diversity and grace and tragicomedy. We also included poetry, and we reviewed film, fine arts, fiction, as well as nonfiction. And we published articles that went out to the sprawling neighborhoods where workers had either been excluded from or due to legal and other reasons blocked from entry to the House of Labor. For roughly a decade now, we've trained our sights far less on organized labor, strictly speaking. And that's because the proliferation of right-to-work laws and aggressive union busting and precarious work have erected such a barricade around the House of Labor that only about 10% of workers actually live there anymore. That fact should incite bold experimentation and serious strategic discussions about organizing, but for complicated reasons, the Federation has not served as a hotbed of experimentation or a venue for planning and coordinating ambitious organizing for many years now. And to mix metaphors wildly, the House of Labor has missed the boat or barely gotten on board. notably for many causes, notably in the case of the massive immigrants' rights organizing in 2006, Occupy Wall Street, mounting protests by Black Lives Matter, climate change resistance, and recently, the AFL's muted response to Trump and his fanning the flames of white nationalism in Charlottesville and beyond. Rather, the promising coalition building and new worker and political organizing is mostly taking place outside of Federation headquarters, at a host of unions and worker centers and within social justice organizations around the country. Many of the more successful of these endeavors are engaged in organizing and collective bargaining that unites and addresses a mix of working class concerns, including those of tenants, foreclosed homeowners, those whose right to vote is increasingly challenged, those whose children have been denied the right to a decent public education. What are these new organizing experiments? Are they sufficiently ambitious and aimed at the right targets? These are the questions we will continue to explore, and they are the subject of today's program. In the spirit of the journal, this will be an evening of bread and roses. So we'll begin with the roses. Of course, art, and in this case, poetry of the working class experience, is often not all that rosy. At its best, its beauty comes from its ability to hold before us, shining or bleeding, the extraordinary within the ordinary, making visible the invisible, regarding the disregarded. In each issue, the journal includes the work of our greatest engaged contemporary poets. Rigoberto Gonzalez is one of those poets. When I invited him to read, he signed on right away and told me that both his father and his grandfather happened to have been card-carrying members of the United Farm Workers. He's born in Bakersfield, California, raised in Michoacan, Mexico. He's the author of several books of poetry, including, most recently, Unpeopled Eden, winner of the Lambda Literary Award. He's also written 2 bilingual children's books, a novel and a memoir. Please join me in welcoming Rigoberto Gonzalez.
Buenas tardes. As Paula mentioned, I do come from 3 generations of migrant farm workers. And I had a wonderful picture of my first march at the age of 2 in Delano. And in it, my grandfather was carrying a clip with paper on it. And I was always sort of intrigued by that because my parents, my grandparents never knew how to read or write. And so one time out of curiosity, I asked, what is my grandfather carrying a clipboard? And what's that paper? And my grandmother finally said, there's nothing on it, because that was his only symbol that he was the one of the directors. So he wanted people to know that, so he carried this. Microphone going okay? Right. And so I say that with pride, because I think that it only took 2 generations to go from an illiterate man who wanted to pass as a literate person to someone who has written 20 books so far and published them. Thank you. Because of that history, I'm very intrigued by labor in this country and the history of labor. And one of those incidents is actually the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. In 2014, it was the 100th anniversary of that, and I thought what an irony that 100 years later, after this pivotal event, which actually ushered in a change in the sentiment of the role of laborers in this country, we're going the other direction. So I went to Ludlow, Colorado, which is now a ghost town, to revisit the history of that place, and I'll weave that story within this poem. The Ghosts of Ludlow, 1914-2014. A century of silence is violence. That winter, a blizzard, a cold that crawled over the Sangre de Cristo mountains and covered the foothills with a crust of ice. Everything whitened into bone. The clothesline snapped like a branch. A warning shot can be understood in any language. The entrance to the coal mine dropped open like the mouth of a skull without eye holes. Mining folk felt safest underground. The pits were for protection from the chill that has stretched into the spring. The pits were for protection from the wind that kept the walls of each tent shivering all night. The pits were for protection. And somehow the kettle still sang, its burst of steam a prized distraction inside the deadness of the tent. In a moment, it was the thing with most life. It filled the small space with breath, an exhale so far away from the hour it would take the first bullet in its lung. The horses crushed the quiet. Their nostrils flared, and suddenly they looked quite human in their rage. One foot sunk its hoof into the face of a doll, an act so cruel it had to have been deliberate. The baby limbs stretched out in shock. No mouth, no throat, no sound. The horse shook its tail like a shrug. Few things gathered the bodies in the camp: a game of baseball, a marriage, a christening, a strike, and war, which darkened the light in the tents, shadow upon shadow, the soldiers first, then the smoke, and then the fall of smothering sky, the pits so womb-like, a refuge for the lambs while the wolf devoured the tents, so sheep-like in their whiteness, so sheep-like in their bleeding. The pits were for protection. One evening the cook was making stew in the cauldron. A witch's brew, said the children, who dared themselves to come near enough to toss a pebble of coal in the pot. The rocks bounced off the bellies of both cauldron and cook. The man cursed, which only made the children giggle. He chased them with a spoon. It made them laugh some more. To teach a lesson, he grabbed a rabbit by the ears. It kicked and splashed as he submerged it under boiling water. He trapped it with the lid. The children screamed in terror, imagining the bunny swimming through the scalding soup, only to reach scalding metal. Grief for a dead child sounds the same in Greek or Italian or Spanish. Grief for 11 children has no language, only numbness. It hardens even the land. Fires dissipated, battles ended. The miners rolled their stories up and left the town of Ludlow 100 years empty, except for the abandoned row of shacks. Near the baseball diamond, a memorial as neglected as the playing field. A memorial rings hollow. It's for the solace of the living. To reach the dead, walk to the structures still standing, their windows still looking in. Listen closely for the ghosts of a woman tucking into bed, the ghost of her son. Lean in. The blank sound you hear, the weight of the ghost of her kiss as it passes through his head, the collapse of absence into absence. Thank you. I grew up on the border in Mexicali, Calexico, and we're very much aware of the maquiladoras, the sweatshops. And so this is one of those sweatshops. It says Perla at the Mexican border assembly line of dolls. You know, I got my eyes fixed so I love swimming in the ocean. And I got my eyes fixed so I could not see those fuzzy figures and just see the fish. And now it's really annoying because I now rarely go to the ocean, so now I gotta wear glasses again. All right, Perla at the Mexican border assembly line of dolls. Her job was to sort through eyes, the eyes of dolls. Snapping hollow limbs into plastic torsos had been a soothing task for Perla, like arranging the peas back into the pod or picking up spilled grains of salt one by one. Since she was born without a womb and her ears closed up because no infant's shrill had kept them open, Perla's fingers had developed sensitivities to dolls. She exchanged her gentle touch for the rigidity, which stiffened her bones to the wrists. At rest, her hands shut down like clamps. But she could not refuse this trade. Sometimes she became too easily attached to the hands, whose curvatures embraced the crooked joint of her index finger. She'd go home with her pocket full of arms too often, and would bury them in her garden in pairs. A right arm with a right arm, a left one with a left, the fingers always pointing down like roots. After seasons, the only growth was the ache inside her bones, while her arms kept shrinking, narrowing like stalks. Perla asked to be moved to heads. Here she was appalled by how strands of hair are jabbed in with pink hooks, how noses and ears are pinched out, and with what brute force the mouth hole is ice-picked through. And for years, she had equipped these dolls with arms too short to massage themselves. Sometimes she had sent them off without arms at all. And she imagined the limbs in her garden digging deeper into earth, like split worms madly searching to comfort their severed halves. So Perla requested the task of sorting eyes, eyes that sink into her thumbs the way rosary beads cave in fingerprints. Yet here she doesn't count or pray. She only teaches how to dull the pain. Her gift, with a squeeze of her rigid fingers, is the luster of the callous tips, their stoic gaze. The dolls give up their the dolls give up the sensibility in eyes that do not blink. The eyes freeze over like the surfaces of lakes, while Perla's fingers feel again, though everything she touches slices clean into her most afflicting nerves. With the pupil locked in place, as if in ice, each eye stares up accusingly at Perla as she's about to push it into place, a tack threatening to thrust back the fury of its nail. Thank you. Now I'm going to read a poem that didn't quite age well because when I read it to really young people, they have no idea what a slide transparency is. I don't have to explain that here, do I? What a slide transparency is? Anyways, I don't have many photographs of my family. My parents died very young, and nobody actually thought to preserve anything. And so much of the possessions that they had just disappeared in the movement back and forth from Mexico and the U.S. So I don't have anything. I only have one photograph of my father, and I have two photographs of my mother. And one of those is this, a slide transparency, which was taken, like the title says, the title is Slight Transparency of My Now Deceased Mother, sitting on the lawn one day before my birth. And this is in Bakersfield. And I'll end with this, and we just want to thank everybody for your attention and for inviting me to be part of this energy in this room. How many times are we going to tired of saying that we've seen harder times. These are hard times, right? That's why we know these are shitty times, but we're going to get through. When I hold you to the light, I see through the petals on your glass dress but not what's inside the dress itself, which makes me question whether I was really there. The bulb's fierce center expanding in your belly is not evidence enough. The cuffs and sleeves of the shirts underlined suspend in the wind at mid-wave. You squint, one shoulder upraised, the way you sit when your back aches. It is summer, the grape-picking season. Your mouth half closed is narrowing down the syllables of my name. Half opened, it's letting go of what you didn't name me. You created other paradoxes, your footfalls fainting as you come closer, growing stronger as you walk away. The white wall of the house behind you is a clear curtain caught by the camera as it disappears, unable to expose what breathes inside. Everything dissolves with hunger. But let's not talk about the sky peeled off, about the flesh of your face thinned out. This is my frame. You sit translucent and tight-fisted. I can hold you to the light or black you out inside my hand. This time, you cannot escape me. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rigoberto. It's poetry and music like this that all social movements depend upon, and when we don't see them connected to those movements, we know that they are withering. We depend on your work. I encourage everybody to read the poetry that's published in every issue of the journal. We are now going to turn to the bread. First up is Stephen Lerner, architect of SEIU's Justice for Janitors campaign, longtime organizer, and I think of him as a strategic ideas factory. Stephen has written regularly for the journal over the years, and perhaps most significantly an article back in 2003 entitled An Immodest Proposal, a New Architecture for the House of Labor. As it turns out, that article set forth the argument that would lead to the split in 2005 in the labor movement. This was a proposal at the time that seemed to offer the possibility for much greater resources and commitment to organizing. I suspect that by now he, like many of us, have some other ideas about what did and didn't happen as a result of the split. But that's the subject for another conversation. Steve.
I'm just going to grab a water here. Okay, I got to put on my timer because I promised I wouldn't go too long here, so hold on one second. So just as I'm getting ready to start, it was really great to have somebody with roots in the Farm Workers Union, because my start in the labor movement was the UFW. I was 16 years old and was a volunteer, and I was trying to figure out what to do in my life. And a woman named Dolores Huerta said to me, do you want to read about history or be part of history? So I dropped out of high school and went to work for the UFW, and here I am years later. So it was great to have you do the intro here. So here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to cover an enormous amount of ground very quickly. I hope it's coherent, because I'm merging 3 or 4 different speeches that normally take half an hour down to 15 minutes. But what I want to tell you first, the outline of what I'm going to do, so then you can see if I do it, which is first, I am going to take a second to reflect on why things haven't gone so well over the last 20 years. And it's not analytical, it's more just some observations, but in the context of what does it mean thinking about the future. Then second, I'm going to theorize a little bit about what's happening in capitalism, which seems to be the system we live under. And then third, I'm going to try to get concrete. And I need to give you the warning that I'm actually quite hopeful. So I know that goes against the mood of the time, but I just want to let you know, I don't know if it's analytical or biochemical. I'm willing to believe it may be delusional, but I need to tell you that my children, who are all grown now, say to me, yeah, Dad, you can give the speech about this is our moment and it's about to happen. But I've been giving that speech for 30 years, so at some point it has to be right. Right? Yeah, okay. So, but before I do that, before I get started, I just want to take the temperature of the crowd for a second and ask a few questions here, which may seem like obvious questions, but you get to raise your hands. It's like the Democratic Party will do a focus group, and then I'll decide what I believe based on what you say. Sorry. So the first question is, and this is an easy one, who here feels the labor movement is primarily working on defense right now? You can raise your hand, okay. Who thinks there's like a plan or a theory about what we should do? The labor movement should do to, okay. Boy, okay. So let me ask you, who thinks that there's something cooking in the country that offers an opportunity that maybe we're missing to do something extraordinary? Okay, I don't need to give my talk, we're done. And I'd end it with, let me just ask this final question, who, despite everything horrible happening, sort of feels a little hopeful when you hear that the majority, is that 44% of young people don't like capitalism? There's something sort of cooking in the world, and I guess that's where I'd really start on my reflections of 20 years ago. I just wanted to throw out a couple things that I think are important, having been in the middle of all of that. First is winning is incredibly difficult. And we just need to be focused on that. No matter how smart the strategy, how much money it is, beating the biggest corporations in the history of the globe is really hard. And that's a big part of the reflection of the last 20 years. But the second would be that if we're honest, that much of New Voices and CTW, Change to Win in reality, was rhetorical, not substantive. You know, it was an embrace of things, but there was of the rhetoric of organizing and change, but in fact, very little actually of that happened in a detailed way. And I just give you highlights of a funny example. I'll leave the other person out. But a staff person at the building trades, a friend of mine and I, we wrote an entire correspondence between John Sweeney and Bob Georgene. I would write the John Sweeney letter, then my friend would tell me, well, this is what Bob Georgene, he was the head of the building trades, will write in response. Then I'd write the response. And this went on, and then out of that, we agreed to do an organizing campaign. But the thing I'm just getting to is it was not deep. It was rhetorical. And on top of that, that one of the things I think we've learned is that money and will, which was a lot of what that moment was about. If we just had the money and the will to organize, we'd win, are insufficient by themselves. They're necessary, but insufficient, absent a broader strategy. And that ties to this idea that much of what we were trying to do was not based on a real analysis of what was going on in the country. If we just had more members, everything would be okay. And I don't think we really dug deeper about all the forces and what it really took to build a movement. Not analytical here, just throwing out some observations. And then finally, that on the Ctw Split, almost all of the principles that were in the article, Architecture for New Labor and all this, were abandoned to make the split happen. Meaning people became so invested in the split, which was really driven by, in the end, all the stuff about jurisdiction and all that stuff, that didn't happen. Industry organizing didn't happen. In fact, the real offer was lower dues if you came to CTW. So I just think it's important that we, without going through it all, that we sort of reflect on how we don't repeat that going forward again. That we have a surface view that's not based on a deep analysis of what's going on. So now I'm going to do a really deep analysis, which I think you've all been waiting for. And you know, I guess the irony here is it seems like the moment is so much riper now than it was 20 years ago, when you look at everything that's going on and the failures of the system. And so we have this irony that in some ways, if 20 years ago all these things have been going on, we might have been more successful, but we now face a moment of huge opportunity where we're much weaker, where we have less capacity, where we're depleted. And I think that leads to this important tension that we need to tease out here, which is at a moment of weakness, I wrote this in a New Labor Forum article, our instinct is to sort of have a protective crouch. I actually call it labor austerity, which is somehow, you know, if we cut the budget, if we're careful and hoard our resources, that something will happen that will then allow us to revive later. And I think the challenge here really is how at a moment of weakness, we have a big, bold vision, strategy, goals that marries the moment. And that we resist this natural urge, which so many unions have now, which is to go into a protective crouch and hope if we survive that some miracle will lift us forward. So, and I think that what we need to do this in the context of is how do we align at this moment of weakness around a vision of the world we want to create that allows us to partner with the energy and the emerging movements, many of which Paula mentioned, and how do we think about our role as not to get more members, but how is it that we're really challenging financialized, racialized, extractive capitalism? And I don't have time to go into all the detail on that, but hopefully those code words mean something to folks. And so when you think about what's going on now, sometimes I think we make simple things complicated and complicated things simple, which is on the one hand, you know, and we talk about the future of work and all this stuff, but sometimes I think we miss what's driving it, which is simply we have aggregation and disaggregation happening simultaneously, meaning wealth and power are aggregating at the top. Fewer people control and own more things, or fewer companies. And simultaneously, work is disaggregating, meaning we work through 20 levels of people. Who signs our paycheck has nothing to do with really who controls our job. Everybody with me on this? And that, so what's fascinating about this is the folks at the top are controlling the economy more, but they want less responsibility legally, morally for any of the conditions they create. And so the problem is that almost all of our work, we're not fighting the folks who really have power. We're fighting somebody who signs our paycheck. We're fighting the middleman. We're fighting some entity. So I think there's question of understanding disaggregation, aggregation, and saying how do we move up the tree and fight the folks who really have power, which is not what we spend most of our time doing. And so one, we have the straight up stuff about giant corporate monopolies, but then we have our other thing, which is a financialization of the economy and how Wall Street really drives everything. And even though they may not own your company, the unrelenting pressure to drive down wages forces subcontracting, the gig economy, it's unending. And that there's no way to imagine how you build a workers' movement if we don't engage who's really driving the economy. This making sense so far? I took a little risk and had a little bit of wine before I started, so you all need to let me know if and I'm trying not to rant like a lunatic, because I have to tell you, I'm so fucking angry about what's going on in the world, so I'm gonna be measured because I'm at an academic forum. Anyway, but I think the thing here is if we're saying one, aggregation, disaggregation, who's really on top, we mainly think about that in the sense of the private private sector, and we talk about the gig and supply chain, but in fact, it's as true in the public sector, which is that in the public sector, we have the exact same thing, which is the private sector has basically private capital taken over the public sector. And who folks bargain with in public sector bargaining has nothing to do with what you can win, because it's really Wall Street and giant corporations that are defining what's possible in the public sector. So you think you're negotiating with Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. You're not negotiating with Rahm Emanuel. You're negotiating with a series of billionaires that control him and the economy there. So if you try to think in a big way about what's going on, is first, disaggregation, aggregation. Second, Wall Street as driving all parts of the economy, redistributing wealth and power to the top. And then when you think about what that all means, and then you add on top of this theory of broke on purpose. People know that expression? So this is what happened in Puerto Rico, which is you implement austerity, you implement a series of policies that make Puerto Rico broke. This is the brilliance of Wall Street. So you save a lot of money. Then what you do is you say, oh, you're broke. We have more and more complicated loan schemes that allow you to borrow money to keep the government going. So first they save money by cutting their taxes. Then they make money on these elaborate tricks and tracks and loan scheme. There's one loan in Puerto Rico where they borrowed, it's a payday loan for government. They borrowed $4 billion, the payback is $33 billion. So then you make money that way, and then after you make somebody broke, and then you loan them money and make money, then you say, oh, you're so irresponsible, we need a control board to take over and then privatize the entire island. And so the idea that we're fighting with our local government or we're fighting with our local employer misses the boat on who's really controlling and driving things. And it's a key problem in the labor movement. And one way to think about this is that the animating idea at the beginning of the 20th century, remember this thing called industrial democracy? It was this idea that you couldn't have democracy unless workers had unions at work and could influence work. And that was based on one scenario. But if you imagine now that private capital controls everything, then what I want to pose, and I'm going to dig into this in a little bit more, is that it's insufficient to imagine that we can challenge private capital just politically and just at the workplace. That we need to look at how they have now put themselves in every part of their lives, our lives. Let me give you an example. Who's heard of Blackstone, the company, Steve Schwarzman? Let's do a poll. Who hates Steve Schwarzman? Thank you. But if you look about what they are, is one, where do they get their capital? Public Employee Pension Fund. So this is part of our assisted suicide program. We fund the people who want to destroy us. Second, they have the biggest infrastructure fund in the country. Third, they avoid taxes. Fourth, they're a major employer. Fifth, they're now the largest landlord in the country. Sixth, I'm not going to go through everything they control. They're now one of the largest debt collectors. So you have this giant company that has, I think, $70 billion in assets. We fund them, and then every part of their business is about how they suck money out of our lives, and the traditional labor response to that is, well, let's organize their workers. But we both won't be able to beat them just by organizing their workers, and even if we could organize a worker, it doesn't go to the depth of how powerful they are. Is this sort of making sense? So it's like, yeah, okay, and I'm also just checking my time here because my phone went off. Hold on a second. Oh, don't worry. Okay, well, I promised I wouldn't go too long. So if you think about this, it's not only, and so maybe if we think about, if you imagine that we've had this total takeover by private capital, then the challenge before us is if they are in every part of our lives, how are we in every part of their lives? How do we challenge them at every part of where they're extracting money? And that would be the other key thing, I think, is most of these folks don't make money by producing things, right? They produce it through extraction. Do you know the famous Volcker quote that he may or may not have said? But I quote it all the time, though I can't find he said it, but it's much better if he said it than I said it, which is that he said the only financial innovation in the last 20 years was the ATM. Everything else is tax avoidance. And so if you imagine you have these giant companies, they take they're driving redistribution of wealth to the top, they're driving politics, et cetera, so you know all that. So everybody agreeing with me so far? It's pretty bad. So the question here is, what the hell do we do about that? And here's the crazy good news. And where we do the best work is when we can sort of do a jiu-jitsu and turn our weakness into our strength. So we have a limited capacity to run lots of 80 different campaigns right now, right? We don't have resources, we don't have money. But because of the incredible concentration of wealth and power, the same guys own everything. And it means that we have a possibility to align our forces in a very, very different way because we got the same enemy. So let me give you an example. Everybody here of Wells Fargo, right? So Wells Fargo is in private prisons. Wells Fargo's in mortgages. Wells Fargo treats its workers like shit. Wells Fargo is bad on pipelines. I won't go through the whole list. So if you imagine a fight with Wells Fargo just as a worker fight, it doesn't lead you anywhere. But if you instead say, here's one of the biggest entities in the country, we can unite all these different forces at the same time to go after Wells Fargo. It both maximizes our power and strength, but it also focuses on who's really controlling everything. You with me? You got that there? Wells Fargo, bad guys. So here's what I want to propose as some things to think about we do. That we take this monopoly and we figure out how we don't think about coalitions. I hate the word coalition. That's where we all sign a pledge to promise to do something we won't do. That we think about how we align our forces. How do we find the biggest, most powerful entities and look at all the different groups and movements that can tackle them at the same time because they're screwing all of us. And I'll give you a couple examples. But before I give you the examples, so let me just sort of roll through what I think we ought to do. Is one, we have to go on offense. We cannot be in a protective crouch and expect to do anything but lose. That second, we have to target not the 1%, but the 0.1%, 1% that really control things. And I want to roll through some ideas of how to think about that. So first, we need to map who they are, right? Both locally and nationally, and all the interconnections. We just found that a teeny little company in Puerto Rico is actually owned by a giant hedge fund. So one, we have to go on offense. Two, we have to target the teeny 0.1% at the top. And then, is there that slide around that we're going to put up? My one slide? Oh, okay. So, and then what I want to just walk through is some of the tools of how we can do this. Has anybody heard of Little Sis? Little Sis is a research wiki, opposite of Big Brother. Little Sis, looking up from the bottom at the top, is one, we can't just depend on union researchers. We need to train a whole cadre of people around the country. on how you can understand who has power and the interconnections. So Little Sis is training people all over the country on how to research who the bad guys are and how they're related. That second, who here has heard of bargaining for common good? So we have this idea, which is in the public sector and in the private sector now too, how do we use public sector bargaining as a way to expand the scope of bargaining? That what happens now is when we go to the table in public sector bargaining, what do we basically do? Fight off concessions. Hold on, something's going on there. Okay, okay. I'll step over. Can you hear me with that? Yeah. So, pause. What's that? Pause. Pause. I get my time back. Okay, there you go. So let me go back a second. Thank you. To re-get my train of thought. What? Through the mic. Okay, let me go back a second. So if we're saying that we have to go on offense, and if we're saying we have to target the 1/10 of 1%, because that's who really controls it, and we can't just focus on who are direct employers, we have to say who really has power, then the first question is understanding who they are. And so we've started all over the country mapping who they are. Little Sis is a great tool. I'm not going to go through what it does. What does my slide say? Then second, in bargaining for common good, what we're doing is all over the country in big public sector bargaining, what we're doing is we're expanding the scope of bargaining. And what we're saying is we don't want to just bargain about wages and benefits. In St. Paul, Minnesota, they've been bargaining about that the school district shouldn't do business with any bank that forecloses during the school year. In Chicago, they've been bargaining about restorative justice and the school-to-prison pipeline, which is how do we take the bargaining moment where we're on defense, go on offense, we're actually bringing community groups to the table, making joint demands, and turning it into political bargaining, because in truth, unless we challenge Wall Street and the banks and the bondholders that are bankrupting the cities, bargaining has no meaning. And as an advertisement, there's a wonderful new article coming out in New Labor Forum about bargaining for common good. And on top of that, February 22nd through 24th, we're going to do a national meeting on bargaining for common good in higher education about all of this. But it's how do we turn the bargaining moment into a political moment that talks about who has money, how do we do it? So that's bargaining for the common good. Who's heard of hedge clippers? So hedge clippers is a campaign to go after the hedge funds and private equity companies that drive political and economic inequality. So what we're doing is first we're mapping who the bad guys are, then we're saying when we go to the table, let's aim at them, and then hedge clippers is how we go to war with them in every part of their life. It's from going to when Cuomo did a fundraiser on Long Island, an air, sea, and land assault with planes and people picketing the event. A lot of work on pension divestment, which is one of the biggest tragedies to me, is how our pension plans are funding the bad guys. So we have hedge clippers, and then a new group has just been formed called ACRE, called the Action Center on Race and the Economy. That's looking at the intersection of Wall Street and communities of color. And they have a simple theory, which is we reflexively say all the time, oh, communities of color get hurt worse by Wall Street or bad things, as if it's an accident. And the idea behind ACRE is that what Wall Street extraction is practiced and focused on communities of color first. And that's where they make their money, and that's their plan. So what we've started to do is say, how do we combine all of these things together at the same time to tackle some of the biggest companies in a way that simultaneously organizes workers? We're now forming a tenants union of people that work in that are in Blackstone-owned homes. We're going to run a pension campaign on divesting from Blackstone and investing in affordable housing. We're going to, I won't go through it all, but we're going to look at every aspect of the company and do this with 4 or 5 different ones so we combine all the best parts of our movement, but it's not about how do we, and I've been guilty of this as much as anybody, how do we put pressure on a company and drop it all because we get a few members? That what's different here at this moment is it's about how do we fundamentally challenge how capitalism is working. And I guess that's really what my takeaway about the CTW and Change to Win and the AFL moment was we were trying to find a niche with the neoliberal capitalism for labor to survive. And it's not possible. We cannot survive, and we cannot survive if our goal is to go backwards. You know, if I go to one more meeting where the labor movement says we have to go back to when we were strong in the 50s, and I say those were the great times, weren't they? We didn't have black people in unions, women were at home, and we were killing peasants all over the world, but it was a really great time for the labor movement. So I think, Don't make that face, Paula. But so the point I'm getting to here is we can't go backwards. We need to link what we want to do with our vision of the future, and part of that vision has to be that it is not by accepting how capitalism operates, but it's by radically changing it. And so I guess what I'd really end with is, imagine if all over the country we were taking all the different things that are going on, from private prisons to Black Lives Matter to water privatization to housing to organizing workers, and we were to say, let's go after some of the biggest, most powerful companies in the world on all of those issues simultaneously. And let's build a movement that challenges them and capitalism, and simultaneously building deep into it. They boast about disruption, right? They always say that disruption is good. Let's figure out, on top of the very strategic organizing, how in a deep, deep way we disrupt the basic fundamental operation of their companies, their personal lives, their schools, and everything, and we make them feel the misery we're feeling. And what I'll end with, because I know I'm over time, is the reason I'm hopeful. I'm not? You're not. Oh my God, my clock says I am. The reason I'm hopeful is this, is there has never been a time where things were this screwed up in recent history. Capitalism is both all-powerful but incredibly fragile. It's boom and bust. And the challenge for all of us is, instead of this view of can we sort of survive and hope it gets better, is how do we seize this moment with a bold, grand vision, with a serious strategy where we're willing to take enormous risks, and use this as a moment where labor in partnership is challenging and really fighting for the view of the world that we want to create. And I think there's something cooking, and the challenge here, my biggest fear, is that the labor movement will serve as a brake instead of an accelerator. And that as things heat up, our instinct of compromise and being practical will stand in the way of what we really need. And what we really need is a movement that both has a vision of what we want, is clear on who the bad guys are, and then has a series of tactics that challenge them in a deep way. And I just want to end with two very quick things, because I think Puerto Rico is so important in this whole world. Puerto Rico is the model for Detroit was a testing ground, Flint was a testing ground. Detroit is the model of financialized, racialized capital, which is to bankrupt us, to suck the money out, to get rid of democracy, and then privatize everything. And so I think as we look at Puerto Rico, it's coming to Hartford, it's coming to all the cities in this country. And I guess what I'm trying to say here, and I feel like I'm a little rambly here, is that we can't, if the 20th century was about industrial democracy, then the 21st century has to be about democracy in the biggest way. And that means democratizing capital. And there is no hope for us if we're trying to bargain wages and benefits while they can move the money, they can sell the water company, they can do everything. So to me, these are all one issue. And the reason I'm hopeful is it's like the labor movement seems to be the one that's missing this, because I think more and more almost everybody gets it. And that this is a time to do something extraordinary. And the way I look at it is we have a moment of peril and opportunity. And you know, there was that what was that famous Rosa Luxemburg quote? What? We have a choice of socialism or barbarism, I think it was. I think we're in such a moment that we have a choice to do something extraordinary, or we can go along with our descent into barbarism. And the reason I'm hopeful is because I think more and more people don't want to descend into barbarism. More and more people want a different world. And I think we have the tools, and we have some of the ideas, and we have the kernels to do it. And hopefully today will be 20 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, remember that the 40-year meeting? It's the day we turned it around and started to build a movement that can change the world. So thanks a lot.
Hey. Thank you, Stephen. I imagine folks want to be able to engage with him, and you will get the chance to do that. We are first going to have a debate here, and after the debate, we'll have a period of Q&A where you can raise questions with Stephen or Phil or Liza. But now we turn to the debate concerning the feasibility and requirements for building what's clearly needed, but nowhere in sight yet. A national, multiracial, working class progressive coalition. Participating in the debate are Phil Thompson and Liza Featherstone, with Ed Ott moderating. Phil is a professor of political science and urban planning at MIT, former deputy general manager of the New York Housing Authority under Mayor Dinkins, and author of Double Trouble, Black Mayors, Black Communities, and the Struggle for Deep Democracy. He's also a frequent author for New Labor Forum, including a piece that'll come out in the January 2018 issue on which this debate is based. Liza Featherstone is a widely published journalist and the author of several books, including Selling Women Short, The Landmark Battle for Workers' Rights at Walmart, and False Choices, The Faux Feminism of Hillary Rodham Clinton. She teaches at NYU and Columbia School of International Public Affairs and is a former columnist for New Labor Forum. And Ed Ott is Distinguished Lecturer at the Murphy Institute, an editorial board member since day one, and he is the person who dreamt up the idea of this journal in the first place.
Okay, I'm just going to lay out how this is, we're going to try to make this work. Each will get 10 minutes to lay out their basic position. I will then offer them up to 5 minutes to respond to each other. I may or may not ask a question at the end of that, depending on where this is going. And then we will open it up to the audience. We will take 3 questions at a time. They will get a chance to respond. The questions at that point can also go to Steve Lerner, who will join us up here. So if you have some comments you want to make on that, that will be the time to do it. So Phil, why don't you lead us off? Yeah.
Oh, I think so. It's okay either way.
Go.
Okay. So, no one should ever be debating race versus class in America. That's just obviously these things are deeply intertwined, and in the American experience, no one is more important than the other. But the question we're going to be talking about is whether, and that we should all be talking about on the left right now, is whether broad appeals to class solidarity and class warfare, economically redistributive agendas, and calls for big universal programs have a place in multiracial left politics right now. I would argue that they do. And in fact, it may be a better time for such politics than we've seen in years. That's how bad things are. Bernie Sanders was rightly criticized on the left for a campaign that had too little to say, a presidential campaign that had too little to say about American racism and nativism. Phil Thompson and I agree, I think, that it was not only Sanders' narrative that was at fault, though this was a problem, but a glaring symptom of the insufficiency, and I think this is more important, of multiracial alliances and relationships on the existing left. He should have been, and the left should be always, engaged in fighting all the barriers to people of color's full democratic and economic participation through voting rights defense, criminal justice reform, and immigration reform. I could talk more about the things that I agree with Phil about, but this is a debate. So I'm going to go right to where we don't agree. Where we disagree is I think Sanders' broad message of class solidarity and class warfare and call for redistributive programs was well received across racial lines, and that its popularity has offered much for the left and the labor movement to learn from and build on. Universal health care, free college, raising the minimum wage by a lot, protection of union organizing rights. Neoliberal Democrats supporting Hillary throughout this campaign did their best to use the rhetoric of racial division to discredit that message, repeatedly insisting black people didn't like Bernie Sanders or his agenda. It's funny, as I was on my way over here, I was realizing, oh, I think I was asked to do this because for the last few years I've been claiming that Sanders' agenda was a vital part of a feminist agenda. And the argument I'm making right now is actually a lot easier because people of color as a group are a lot more progressive than women as a group. So that's something kind of interesting. So even some, so we heard a lot about from the Hillary campaign and from her supporters, free college won't solve racism, and even some left liberals bought into this narrative. Phil, in New Labor Forum, argued Sanders' social democratic vision and analysis was in key respects off base. It cost him black and Latino support that might have enabled him to defeat Clinton and perhaps Trump as well. It's worth taking a look at this. I think this is wrong. Let's take minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage is a deeply multiracial issue, both in organizing practice and in its effects, and in public opinion. Raising the minimum wage has a positive effect from the millions of workers at the low end of the labor market who are disproportionately workers of color. Not surprisingly, given how much they benefit, according to the Pew Center, large majorities of blacks and Hispanics support a $15 minimum wage, and actually only a slight majority of whites. Universal health care. This is actually even more dramatic. A majority of Americans support single-payer health care, and since Bernie Sanders' campaign, those numbers have continued to go up. Pew polling this year found it's especially popular among blacks and Hispanics, with 85% of blacks and 84% of Hispanics supporting it. And why wouldn't they? I mean, who do we think the uninsured are? They are not primarily white college students. College tuition, speaking of college students, while there's support for this is again broad support among all racial groups, but for African American young people who go to college, student debt is a very significant burden, far worse than for white college graduates. Most Americans support making college free, in fact, and this is again an effect of the Sanders campaign, I'd argue. And like single payer, it's far more prominent in the discourse than it was before that campaign. Also, like Sanders' other ideas, it has far more support among people of color than among white Americans. It is supported by 84% of African Americans, 90% of Hispanics. How many ideas are supported by 90% of people in such a diverse group? It's hard to think of any idea that has 90% support from any group. Only about half of whites support free college, actually. Why are Sanders' ideas? So actually, contrary to the liberal narrative, the question should actually be, why were Bernie Sanders' ideas so popular among Americans of color? That question is not very hard to answer. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the majority of what we would call the working class are people of color. Those are working class people who are very well aware of their class interests and support redistributive politics. Many of the sort of binary arguments during the primary campaign were actually kind of strange. Sanders was Sanders went down sort of a strange rabbit hole around reparations for black people, for slavery. But as writer Yvette Carnell pointed out at the time, the NAACP's reparation plan for African Americans was quite similar to Bernie Sanders' plan, involving broad redistribution programs, broad investment in education, in cleaning, environmental cleanup in poor communities, this makes a lot of sense. So, not surprisingly, given the broad agreement with the Sanders agenda, Bernie Sanders is right now the most popular active politician in the country. African Americans view him, about 73% of African Americans view him favorably, again much higher than whites. 68% of Latinos and 62% of Asian Americans, and 52% among white voters, still a majority, though a small one. And when we think about Sanders' broad popularity, I don't know if you've met the guy, but I have. It's not his personality. It is definitely about the man's agenda. I mean, that's and if you met him, you know what I mean. And I say this with love. And then so thinking about this a little further, and sort of thinking about it in a sort of future-looking way. The support for Bernie Sanders and presumably his agenda, is far more overwhelming if you look at African Americans under 30 who actually did vote overwhelmingly for Sanders. I mean, in a way, like what we're calling for, I think, what particular agenda, what particular program is in some way less important than how and whether we build power. But I would argue that there are many aspects of this approach, the broad class politics, class warfare approach, that would help us to do this. And I think particularly instructively, ignoring working class economic issues and even at times deriding them, as Hillary Clinton largely did, has a demonstrable record of failure. And the entire working class, especially people of color and women, are living with the results of that failure every day.
Do I have to use my? You can try if not. If they complain from the corners, I'll make you use it. You can use the podium too. Is that right? Yeah, absolutely.
So I wrote down what I'm going to say. I'm going to start with where Steve left off and talk about the economy for a minute. With the advent of microelectronics, a technique that began with industrial capitalism has been magnified. The technique substitutes machines, computers, the internet, and robots for workers. This substitution is about to happen on a far deeper and wider scale. Robots will soon stock shelves in the big box stores. Walmart's testing it out now. Your radiology scan will be read in India, and on and on. This is bound to keep happening during capitalism because businesses are trying to make profits, and it's cheaper to automate and digitize than not to. The fundamental limit of capitalism is that you have to sell products to make a profit. When you substitute machines for workers, then workers don't have money to buy products. So eventually, the more advanced and high-tech our economy becomes, the harder it is to sustain profits and keep the system going. This is the underlying contradiction in our economy, and there is no way out of it within the confines of profit making, and I want to underscore that. Because profits are harder and harder to make in the traditional productive, or what some call the real economy, big business and Wall Street have gone heavily into speculation, like Steve was talking about. That's what happened in the 2008 crash. That's what's happening with Bitcoin this week. They are also marketing fictitious capital. For example, Nigeria owes Western banks something like $50 billion, and in 10 years it'd be more like $70 billion because of compound interest. Nigeria in no way can pay back $50 billion or even $10 billion. That money that's on the books of these banks is fictitious. Like high interest loans were for low-income homeowners in 2000, leading up to 2008, they call them toxic loans, same thing. But there's massive amounts of these fictitious loans on the books, you know, floating around. There also is a bigger thing now called crony capitalism. Steve talked about that. That's when big business buys off politicians to stop taxing them so they can make up for lost profits by free riding on government, or they pay politicians to privatize public goods like highways, bridges, hospitals, and public schools so they can make profits off of things that used to be free or provided at cost. All of this amounts to stripping away the gains working people made over the last century under the pretense of fiscal austerity. The austerity is entirely artificial. It's self-induced by our refusal to tax the wealthy. Republicans like Paul Ryan and Ted Cruz justify this with a kind of religious fervor. Everything must be done through the market. The market is God. Capitalism is God. Government is the devil. Taking money from God and giving it to the devil is evil. I'm not exaggerating. This is actually the kind of rhetoric that they use. It's important not to lose sight of the fact that we are a rich country. Austerity is not necessary. Unemployment and low wages are not necessary. These are all self-induced things. The stores are full. Our productivity and capacity has never been so high. Because of science and technology, the annual corn harvest in Kansas alone can produce 139 billion loaves of bread each year. The Household Wealth Survey released yesterday showed that household wealth in the US reached nearly $100 trillion, the highest recorded. Yet all the gains are going to the already rich people. Rich people can only eat so much food, drive so many cars, and live in so many houses. I think Mitt Romney has 14 houses. That seems to be a limit. They can only stimulate the productive economy a little bit. And working people have less and less money and are getting thrown into permanent unemployment more and more. So workers can't access the material wealth of our society, even though the goods are plentiful. There's a straightforward alternative that can solve these problems. This would be direct government investment in public works, education, affordable housing, healthcare, for the most part on a public, nonprofit, or cooperative basis. I don't disagree with Bernie there. The entire nation could be gainfully employed doing these things. The country desperately needs a green infrastructure to deal with climate change. We need better rail and air transport. We need to educate young people and workers in STEM because that's the future economy, core skill in the future economy. We desperately need affordable housing and health care. We have 80 million people reaching old age in the next 10 years, and they need to be cared for. Most of this kind of work happens at the state and local level, which means we need a big expansion in the planning and investment capacity of state and local governments and major investments in nonprofits like colleges and community health agencies. We can't even begin to move in this direction until we beat back the big lie that public institutions are wasteful and unnecessary. The opposite is true. The most significant gains in productivity have come from science and technology inventions and discoveries come mainly from government-funded research and development. And I work at MIT, this is the lifeblood there. The tech world is discovering that the internet makes it possible for thousands of engineers to collaborate on creating digital products, and the power of these collaborations are far beyond what even the biggest corporations like IBM and Apple can match. The traditional capitalist notions of keeping your ideas secret, getting a patent so you can own it all, and then the collaborative engineers that are inventing these things view that way of approaching development as a hindrance, as something that's holding back, what they can do. What they are stuck on is how to compensate people when you can't quantify everyone's particular contribution, when you have just loads of people sharing ideas. What this calls for is something like a social wage and a social approach to development. If labor unions were organizations that thought about things like this, labor would be very popular among the techies right now. The point I'm making is that we ought to be a flourishing people right now. We have the material and intellectual means to flourish. Instead, we are sinking. And what is holding us back is ideology and politics, and I'll say a few words about that. I just mentioned the notion of a social wage and a social economy. We've always had a social economy, but we don't name it. If you look at women and capitalism, capitalists segmented off work that didn't create profits and called it women's work. Raising children, taking care of the low-income elderly, cooking and feeding people, making beds, washing clothes, teaching children, the work needed to reproduce the workforce, all of this women were supposed to do for free. This work was and still is essential to the economy, but it's the social economy. Most of it is invisible to the GDP or Dow Jones, but we can't survive without it. The social wage for women was historically zero. Ideologically and culturally, men were the heroic breadwinners or the heroic soldiers. Women had little recognition at all, basically nothing more than their bodies. This ideology is why we today pay home care workers so little, and kindergarten teachers so little, and waitresses so little. It's not because their work has little value, it's because that value doesn't show up in big profits. What would you say the value of a good teacher is for your kids, or a good home care worker who comforts your grandmother? You can't put a price curve on that. We're not talking about widgets or commodities for sale. It's a matter of social values and politics. Now that women are demanding true equality, including economic equality, for the reproductive work they still mainly do, women are running straight up against our profit system and against market fundamentalism. The social economy is a care economy. Taking care of children, elderly, poor, and needy people should not be subject to the market. The people doing this quote-unquote women's work should be paid as much as people who do the profit-making work. The public sector has this critical responsibility. The issue is way beyond the behavior of Roy Moore or movie producers in Hollywood. It's about the basic structure and fairness of our economy. The fight over the value of the public sector is largely about this. The fight is not just about women, it's about children, the elderly, the disabled, the needy, it's about all of us. Labor will never win decent contracts for home care workers or teachers or waitresses by doing backroom deals with politicians. The entire country has to see what's at stake here. It's not about helping unions or the Democratic Party feminists. It's about our families, our communities, and our future. Race, like gender, is as fundamental to economic structure as money. Capitalism created not one, but two proletariats. The first consisted of black slaves and brown and yellow colonial subjects. The second consisted of white American and European workers. This racial division was maintained through racial segregation at home and imperialism abroad. White men were given a supervisory role over the colored proletariat in the workplace and via government through police and the military. This structure continues still. It's what underlies our fights against police brutality, stop and frisk, and mass incarceration, How else do you explain decades of mass imprisonment of black people for marijuana and cocaine compared with the outpouring of sympathy and humane treatment of masses of white opiate users today? There's also always been a separation between black and white workers in the economy, with black workers firmly on the bottom. The gap in median income between black and white workers hasn't changed since 1955. The median white family had 11 times the wealth of median black families in the 1980s. Today, black families have 1/25 the wealth of white families. By 2050, if current trends continue, black families are projected to have 0 wealth. Clearly, there are some different things going on in white and black communities. Those underlying conditions structure politics. White workers do have more to lose than their chains. They could be treated like black people or like Latino immigrants. Because of this two-proletariat structure, black and white workers have never been able to stay in a political coalition across the country for any length of time. Never. A majority of white workers have not voted for a Democrat since the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. Now that workers of color will be a majority of the country in a couple of decades, and among young workers, that transition is happening now, there is no way that any group of workers, white, black, Latino, or Asian, can be successful without the support of the others. This is a new and unprecedented scenario for white workers. It's not new for workers of color. We have always known that we can't get very far with white workers in opposition. And if you read polls historically of the black community, over 80, Michael Dawson's book, Black, over 80% of black people have class consciousness. They think America is a class-structured economy, 85%, in fact. And over 95% think there's a racial hierarchy in America as well. Black folks have always seen class as well as race. It's not either or. It's the white folks who actually don't see those things in nearly to that degree. So I'm not surprised that black people are supporting universalistic calls and help everybody. Black folks have class consciousness. Have. When you're been a slave, then you get that capitalism is a game, and it's a power game, and your grandmother wasn't an animal or a commodity. You get that. We have always known we can't get very far with white workers in opposition, but it is really a new situation for most white people. I also think it's new for the labor movement. Labor isn't going to survive without communities of color strongly supporting labor. But I don't think labor has processed this reality hardly anywhere. The tradition of the white left has been to treat black people as an afterthought or as a junior partner, whether in labor or politics. Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, made this mistake, and I voted for Bernie. Jerry Hudson and I wrote a long memo to him, suggestions of things he should do. He didn't do. He said free college tuition helps everybody, but in fact, this is more important to young white people because a majority of them are in college, and the cost of loans is their issue. A majority of black kids are not in college because they can't get in the door. A lot of them are in jail or never got out of high school. That's their issue. Sanders talked a lot about raising the minimum wage. He didn't talk so much about permanent unemployment. Yet decades-long permanent unemployment is the #1 issue in black communities. These discouraged workers are not even counted in unemployment statistics. Sanders could have done the reverse. He could have started talking about black workers on the bottom for the last 400 years and then worked his way up to free college tuition and raising the minimum wage. He could have signaled the importance to him to address the continuing racial segmentation of our society. He could have made it clear that for him, black people are not an afterthought. Okay. Like everyone else, black people are looking for an inspiring vision. I find young progressive people of color have dreams and aspirations that go far beyond making $15 an hour, as important as that is. They want to be recognized and treated differently in society. They want their own voice to be heard. If the labor movement can't respond to this yearning, then many of us in the people of color left will have no choice but to start building a new and different kind of freedom movement. I finally want to say that seeing the leadership of the building trades in the White House talking about how excited they are about Trump and his agenda was a new low. if labor isn't willing to take a stand against Trump's blatant racism at this point and call out its own leadership for supporting anti-worker racists like Trump, I don't see much of a future for the labor movement, or at least for this labor movement. Thank you.
So I agree with most of what Phil just said. Just want to say a couple things. On the issues that Phil mentioned, the minimum wage and college. Phil is of course right. Two-thirds of the two-thirds of young African Americans are not in college, so that is a significant difference with the young white population. However, the cost of college is a significant part of that picture. The cost of college is a significant reason why a lot of African Americans wouldn't be in college, and for those who do go, their college debt and default on debt is a much more serious burden than it even is for young white people, so it's not surprising that such a large majority of people of color would be supporting that agenda of Sanders. It really, it is something that, of course, affects people differently, and so clearly. The issue of access to college, can you even afford to pay your room and board? Can you even afford to eat once you get there? It has to be talked about differently for different groups of people depending on their access. But it was clearly an extremely popular platform among people of color, and for a very good practical reason. As for the minimum wage, absolutely, the issue of permanent long-term employment was not discussed by Bernie Sanders, and certainly should have been, and so was the and similarly, he certainly should have talked a lot more about criminal justice reform and the fact that many young African American men are ex-felons and therefore have trouble finding employment. On the other hand, it is still the case that the vast majority of low-wage workers are people of color. Most people are not former felons. Most people need decently paying. Everyone needs decently paying jobs, and most people are employed. In fact, also in regards to unemployment, unemployment is not. Phil's point about machines is well taken, but unemployment is not actually increasing in this way. So that's also something else to think about. That when we look at the workplace as a site of struggle, it really remains a quite salient one. In terms of, I think that Phil's point is well taken, that white people, even when they're working class, are really conservative and are a huge, and that's a huge barrier to the kinds of coalitions and politics that we're discussing here. However, when he says that white people and black people have never remained in alliance or coalition for long, I'd actually point to the labor movement, not the labor movement as a broad whole fighting for better politics and a broad political agenda, but I would look at the way that individual organizing campaigns function. that in fact workers of different races very much do remain allies and do remain in solidarity over the long term in those situations, and that is one reason the labor movement is actually one of the few hopeful models for politics in this country. That you can't really wait around for white people to get more progressive, but they actually do tend to get more progressive in this process of struggle and in the process of struggle with of multiracial struggle. So, just want to throw that out there.
Well, I'm not opposed to free college tuition. I'm not opposed to $15 an hour minimum wage. I'm not opposed to multiracial organizing campaigns. I'm in favor of all those things. But if you go to Central Bed-Stuy or East New York or Brownsville, more than 1 in 3 black men under 35 are in the criminal justice system. If you go to the south side of Chicago, over 750 black children murdered each other last year, and all of them were unemployed, okay, and not educated. That is the problem in black communities. It's been that way a long time. And it's not to say these other things aren't good, it's just not getting to what is the problem. In terms, and, you know, if we're not talking about this, more black and Latino kids kill each other every year in the US than died in the entire Vietnam War. Children. So if we're not talking about this, what the hell are we talking about? You know, we're skipping over something that everybody sees, everybody's afraid of, right? And we're not going to deal with it and call ourselves a liberation movement, a freedom movement, and progressive this and that. That's my point. Second, unemployment. Look at labor force participation. If you give up looking for a job, they don't count you anymore. Labor force participation in the black community has been stuck at 60% for decades. And we're talking about healthy, working age people. Just give up. Huge numbers. Since auto went under and steel went under, it's been like that. And the people who are working, as you know, a lot of it is underemployment. And we're serving each other coffee, okay? Yeah, for next to nothing. And our consumer purchasing power has been going like that and stagnant. You can't grow profits based on that. That's the point. That's the point. And it's a global trend. You know, it's all over the world. You want to know where ISIS came from? Look at how many of these people were employed who joined ISIS before they got in there. Look at unemployment rates worldwide and what's going on. In terms of solidarity in the labor movement, that's great. You know, I think it's great that some white men still want to be in the labor movement and don't mind working with women and people of color. How many of them are there? How many are left in the labor movement? I don't think we build a really big labor movement with lots of these white men in it unless we address racism, unless we address gender, hatred of women, you know, unless we address these issues, unless we explain to them feminism like how it connects to them in a whole different way. That's what I'm saying. And I don't see how we, given where the country is going, the demographics are going, the fact that young workers are majority of color, if labor isn't speaking about these issues in a really different way, then we don't build a labor movement. I think, you know, you were pointing at that with collective bargaining, new ways of bargaining, extending it, dealing with other issues, bring it in. I think that's exactly right. We have to move beyond the boxes that we're in. And labor kept black people out. My dad was the first union member in the Pennsylvania Railroad Workers Union. You know how we got in? Through a lawsuit, right? And that's how black workers even got in the labor movement. It hasn't been this friendly, open, I go to the AFL-CIO headquarters still. The posters on the wall, the drawings, the beautiful murals start with the Lawrence, Massachusetts, and the women and children workers fighting for the 8-hour day. It's beautiful. But I'm like, where's Harriet Tubman? Where's the Civil War? God damn it. You think the Civil War was just about skin color? It was about labor. 300, 250 years of unplayed work. You don't think that was what the fight was about? Come on. Why isn't that part of labor's own narrative? Why don't white workers in the AFL-CIO take pride in that fight? And all these soldiers who volunteered and fought, that was real unity. Why don't we take pride in that? It's not in the labor narrative. That's what I'm talking about. You know, we gotta change.
Thank you. Just one question I'm going to try to throw out here, and then Steve, you come up, take this seat, and I'll go to the podium and field questions from the audience. But one thing that I'm kind of interested in, and something that you wrote, Phil, that I had seen, tried to engage the question of infrastructure. And I think both kind of positions, whether you're taking a kind of broader universal view of how do you build class unity, but infrastructure plays out very differently in different communities. And I would kind of like both of you from your political perspective, because Bernie, the labor movement, the black leadership of the country, all were addressing questions of infrastructure, except Hillary Clinton, actually, during this last period. So I'd like to both, from your basic political point of view, how does infrastructure questions play out going forward? What's the struggle?
Well, I guess I mostly come at infrastructure issues as a New Yorker, because when I have occasion to write about them, it's in my local AM New York column, so it is always very much about what is going to how do you fix the lack of access to transit in the most marginalized communities? I mean, how do you expand the bus system? Like, what do you do about the problem that expanding making a ferry from Brooklyn to Queens is probably going to increase gentrification. I mean, all of those kinds of problems. But I think that I think that infrastructure was actually something that Bernie Sanders could have talked a lot more about. Frankly, I mean, there was I think one of the strengths of his campaign was that he did seem to hear the concerns of manufacturing workers who had lost their livelihoods in Middle America, and spoke to those concerns. On the other hand, there are such clear solutions to those problems in the form of infrastructure and the green economy issues that Phil has talked about. And I think that those solutions actually tended to get short shrift. I also think, though, that when we talk about manufacturing, an unfortunate feature and a horrific feature, actually, of the discussion over the last 2 years is that people think that former manufacturing workers are white. I mean, and in fact, the deindustrialization has just in Middle America, as Lou Uchitel writes in his great little book, Why Manufacturing Still Matters, which is like a very short, very good book that just came out this year. It's that the deindustrialization has been particularly devastating to African Americans in Middle America. So I think that's one way that the infrastructure debate and the issue of, like, how do you bring back manufacturing, or how do you put more people to work, has weirdly taken on this this sort of quality of whiteness that that completely ignores the massive racial injustice of the loss of manufacturing.
Actually, I really am not pessimistic about economic prospects at all. I really, what I think is holding us back is politics and ideology. So there are 900,000 buildings in New York City that need to be retrofitted for energy efficiency. That's work for generations of people. It would save 40% in our collective energy bill. It would pay for itself and then generate revenues long after that, okay? We're not doing it. The state is investing over $1.5 billion in Brooklyn, central and eastern Brooklyn, to rebuild the grid. The way that stuff happens, young engineers like the kind we have, my students, they come into Brooklyn and say, you know, hey, we're going to come do this for you, and you're going to be all green, and we're going to make money. Actually, this thing could be community-owned. And the way energy, the state is pushing for local generation. The way energy works is like when you go to the hotel and they tell you, if you want to be green, don't, you know, put your, hang up your towel, you know, and we won't clean it, and then you're green. And then they save money, right, because they don't hire people to do laundry, and they don't give you any money back. They just make money, okay, and you get to say you're green. It's the same with these energy grids. You can sell energy back to the grid during peak hours at 2 in the afternoon. If you do that, you can make money. So these entrepreneurs are coming in and saying, hey, people, be green. Don't do laundry at 2 in the afternoon. You know, do it early in the morning. Don't do it late at night. And then they run the generator and sell energy back to the grid, and they pocket the money. There are a lot of opportunities, a lot of ways we can do infrastructure differently to generate a lot more economic opportunity in communities. I go to LaGuardia Airport a lot. I'm waiting still to see the very first Black or Latino heavy equipment operator. I'm not talking about the laborers union. I'm talking about heavy equipment operators where they make $100 an hour. When are we going to desegregate the building trades? You know, talking about infrastructure and not talking about systemic, historic, 100-year-old segregation in the building trades once you get above minimum wage, you know, has to be a crucial ingredient of any serious kind of infrastructure. And the last thing I'll say is finance. The way labor thinks about investing their money, workers are all so desperate, they're saying, it all depends on me getting a maximum interest rate back on my pension. So the pension fund managers all want 25%, and they're all worried about their dipping down. And meanwhile, workers are being pushed out of their homes, pushed out of their communities, can't afford to live in the city. If workers invested in worker housing, they could cut their housing costs, and they would make more money than any bump up in interest rates they would get. But that takes a social campaign, a social outlook, and an actual designs and strategies to get that done. And I think there are a million gazillion things like that we could do to put people to work, to save workers money, improve their lives in all these ways that I've been talking about. So I think all that stuff's very doable, actually. I really think if we get our politics right, we can do this.
All right, we're going to take questions. I'm going to try to go across the room, take from different sections. I got far left, you, and then you right here. Let's go ahead. Stand up. If you,
unions, and our crisis right now is that our which is not one of our divisions that has I forget the name of it, but the division that has field technicians, this the Spectrum workers have been on strike since March. I don't think my union has even had a strike before that for like 2 decades. So it's a big freaking deal. But when they authorized the strike, Spectrum just went about and hired replacement workers, and nobody even really pays attention to the fact that there's still a strike of actual legitimate union members. And they keep coming back with renegotiations, the business reps, and they keep rejecting the contract. They even recently came out with the same exact contract that they had 2 years ago, and Spectrum still rejected it because Spectrum is a new company taking over Time Warner, and they were never friendly to unions. So my question is, if we want to get any progress in this to defeat Spectrum in this manner and to get a leg up on contract negotiations, how can we really ally ourselves with people and get the kind of support it will take to do that?
Thank you. Please.
Yes, domestic workers who take care of property, not people, are called home improvement workers. Domestic workers who take care of property, not people, are called home improvement workers. And they're excluded from the building trades opportunities, but they're also excluded from the domestic workers' Bill of Rights. I think the segregation that you're talking about is there, and it's interesting that I did this for 20 years. I wouldn't join a trade association for building trades because that would mean giving my precious resources to rolling back labor standards and environmental standards, which was the agenda of the building trades trade association. Now they're against the tax plan, comments about the tax plan and labor and building trades.
One more. Right there.
Nathan Newman. I guess the question, everybody wants the endpoint to be universal benefits. The question is, in the shorter term, does that get it? And I guess looking at public education, which is the oldest universal benefit out there, but when it's embedded in a racist, classist system, you end up with it not delivering universal. And so there's the skepticism that anything universal will end up. I mean, you see it with charters and with vouchers, have never had any popularity in white suburb, white communities. The most popularity has been in the most diverse communities because the problems of public education are most centered there, and you see people with their votes and marching. So I think that's part of it. Is in the short term, Cuomo did free education, except it was structured in a way that was going to benefit systematically the most elite people. And so there is the fear, not that the rhetoric isn't good, but that the translation will inevitably, if you aren't addressing the specifics of race and gender.
Let's start with the last question first, and then we'll work them back. Go ahead, Steve, you want to jump in?
I see myself as a campaigner, and the way we do a lot of this is by campaigning against bad guys. And so I think the way we sharpen some of this is by drawing the connection. So I'll give you a specific example. There's a guy, Seth Klarman, that probably none of you have heard of, who is a big hedge fund guy. He's one of the key funders of charter schools. It turns out he's also a huge owner of vulture funds and Puerto Rican debt. And so I think and I felt like I didn't nail this in the talk that I did, is that by showing the multiple ways they do bad things, that we're then able to undercut their basic argument. So when Seth Klarman says, well, I'm for good schools for poor, or the better example in New York is this guy, Dan Loeb, that has been lecturing people about, you're a racist if you're not for charter schools. When you look at the full range of everything Dan Loeb does, which is oppose the minimum wage, fund bad things, then it sharpens this argument that these set of characters aren't really concerned about education for communities of color. They're into privatizing everything because that's their ideology, going back to what Phil said. So to me, the moment that we have is by drawing the connections and then basically dirtying them up and show that they're not credible on anything because of what they're actually doing in their business practice. So that's how part of how I look, how I think we get to the education and a lot of the privatization issues.
Liza, Phil?
I want to speak to Nathan's question, and then also, and people should definitely address the IBEW question. So the exact question that you ask is actually something that I'm about to embark on a large project about with my friend Jessica Blatt, who's a political scientist, and we are both public school parents and have been fairly active and engaged in writing and protesting on these issues for a long time. I think if you look at, I think the struggle over public education is a really great example of how you have to fight to make these big public programs more inclusive, and at the same time you also have to make arguments for why broad public goods are good for everyone, and we see exactly one of the things that happened in the New York City fiscal crisis was that people had been fighting for years to make CUNY more accessible to people of color, and to make public schooling of better quality across neighborhood lines, and so, but because those struggles were incomplete, people were in a much more vulnerable position when austerity came down the pike, because it's much harder to defend public institutions that are not working for everybody, and so it's just absolutely something that you have to do all at the same time. You cannot say, well, we'll work on the inclusivity once we take Betsy DeVos down. It's like, no, you have to work on everything all at once. And please, somebody who is qualified to address that spectrum question.
I would just go back to something Steve said about looking at the big picture and looking at money. So in 2007 and 8, the Feds spent about $10 trillion bailing out mostly wealthy investors. And then the big banks have been sitting on $2 trillion that the Feds gave them at 0% interest since then, and not investing it because they don't see where they can make big enough profits, in the real economy, so it's sitting there. And the federal government, basically, all new money these days actually is done from banks, which means all of it has to be profit-making, and the banks get to decide what gets invested in and what doesn't. That is our federal policy right now, and it has been for a while. Those trillions of dollars, the $2 trillion that's sitting there, there could have been a $1 trillion affordable housing program. There could have been a $1 trillion energy efficiency program to do all the buildings, and it could have been done union. And the fight over what we do with our money, that's what I'm talking about. If we get our politics together, we are not short of money. $10 trillion went for wealthy people, and we are living under austerity. And we're talking about unemployment. The only contradiction between science and technology and employment is if you have to make a profit, because then you're under pressure to replace workers with machines. If you are not funneling it through companies that say we have to make a profit, right, then you don't have to lay off people every time you make a scientific breakthrough and invent a new machine. You can actually transfer people to do something else that's important, like the seawater is rising. We ought to be doing something about that, et cetera. So that's what I'm trying to get to. I don't think we are, I really think it's pretty simple. We need to take control of our money. We need to take control of our government.
I'm going to jump in on the spectrum strike, just so for time expediency, because we want to get to some other questions. I'm going to offer you the tale of two strikes. The Verizon strike goes into with a plan that was also not afraid to attack the customer base of the company. They went right after them. They had an extensive network of support groups ready to man picket lines when they knew that the strike would go on. Different groups adopted a day. People from Murphy here, every Wednesday, 4 o'clock, they were out picketing. I think that when IBEW went into this strike, They didn't have a real plan, and they hadn't developed a community base of support that could back them up. But most fundamentally, they refused, and this was in their old tradition of IBEW. They always believed they got to work the next day with the employer. They refused to attack the employer's fundamental interest, which was making money, because they were afraid. And the thing that's interesting about that, and a lot of unions do this, is not a particular criticism of them. A lot of unions are afraid to go really after the company because they'll get mad at them. Here you are out on strike, and you're still worrying about trying to preserve a relationship that clearly doesn't exist. So I would compare it to the Verizon strike, and it might be helpful to you. I'm going to take some other questions. 1, 2, and 3 over here in the back. Please, quickly.
So here's a quote from the biggest optimist of all. Now and then, workers are victorious, but not for long. Who said that? Who said that? Everyone in this room should know that.
Get to your question.
Communist Manifesto. All right? You know, I'm not in favor of democratizing capital. I'm not in favor of challenging how capitalism is working. I'm not in favor of focusing on the biggest entities. I'm in favor, and Marx would have been in favor of integrating the building trades union, but at the same time, note that the building trades union is being decimated in New York City right now. I think the biggest defensive crouch of unions is the unwillingness to talk about the biggest entity, which is not Wells Fargo, but the state. And when the unions are willing to talk about the state, then maybe we can win.
Time is an issue. Who's the second question? Right here, down here, the woman.
Hi. So I actually have a question, and it's been boggling my mind for a long time, but it's really boggling my mind now that we're talking about it. So I work in public education right now, and I also have been at the Murphy Institute, and I did my master's in labor studies. That question about like the people who have control over the resources, right? I think that that's what I see every day in a nonprofit in public education, where we have funders who fund our programs, and they're giving resources to kids, but they can also say what we can and cannot do. And I guess my question is, and maybe it's more of like a rhetorical question or like a theoretical question, but like what do we do in the interim where we do have these entities that have the power over our money and resources for our children, and particularly children of color? How do we get, I guess, how do we go from having this and like not depleting their resources in real time, and then also getting our resources back? Again, it's rhetorical.
Okay, third question in the back.
Yes, 2 parts.
Stand up, please.
Stand up.
Yeah, they can't hear you.
So the first part of my question has to do with Sylvia Federici's interpretation of what primitive accumulation is. It's about the accumulation. The first part of my question is about Sylvia Federici's interpretation of primitive accumulation. She describes it as not only an accumulation of labor by force, but also accumulation of differences. And she's pointing out that a racial hierarchy and a sex hierarchy is constitutive of capitalism. It cannot be understood as something distinct. It is how the thing emerges. It's how the metabolism works. Okay, so racial solidarity is essential. I mean, it's not like something that we can get to if there's time. That point is well taken. It is discouraging to hear that, particularly from you, that you don't see very much hope sort of in history of where racial solidarity can happen. So, even if instances are short-lived, moments in history where we see promising examples of racial solidarity would be helpful. And then my second question, and this is mostly for Stephen, is about the state, because I take...
You're going to really have to wrap it, because the truth is we're over time.
Out of time. Okay. All right. Well, I'll get you privately then.
Okay, good. Yeah, there'll be time to talk afterwards. Any of those last 3 questions somebody would like to respond to? Go.
I'm not sure what the questions are, but I'll...
She had a question.
Right. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, that was a question with a question mark.
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that
Okay.
question, but I did want to say, I just wanted to give one example, because I think one of the things is, how do we actually make this real in real life? And I want to give an example from Real Campaign, which is the Wells Fargo scandal. That was reported by workers who are forming a union. And so I think one of the challenges for us, and it goes to this point that you were making, Ed, about do we see the employer as our ally or as our enemy, is how when we're organized, so you cannot regulate banks unless workers are the regulators, because they are trained to cheat people. So we have an entire bank worker organizing campaign that is not based on how just you make more money, but is based on workers don't want to sell predatory products for a living. So I think one of the things as we try to turn some of these theories into concrete work, it's when our organizing wears two hats. How do we make workers' lives better, and how do we change the institutions that are screwing them and other people? And so I think that's one of the ways that we start to get to some of these issues. So I just wasn't answering a question, I just forgot to say that. I'll be honest.
So I do want to answer that question from the back, and the question was, what are some hopeful examples from history of multiracial successable organizing? I'd argue the Communist Party in the 1930s was a very multiracial organization and was in many ways very successful, both on the things that they actually organized for and won, but also as for creating a threat to the capitalist class. Which is part of the reason that we got New Deal liberalism in the first place. So
okay, Phil, last word.
That kind of threat.
In an academic setting, we can have a long debate over the Communist Party in the 30s and how multiracial and how inclusive they were. That's not how I understand it. But I think there are a lot of examples of hope in our history, and I mentioned the Civil War and the radical Republicans, and I think we ought to take pride in that. But right now we see a neo-fascist movement on the rise, and the president is fanning that on, and I think we have to just be sober about that. Now is the first time in my lifetime when, in the 60s, I remember black folks were in motion, white students were in motion, white workers were not in motion. Right now, everybody's in motion. And I think that's good. Even though, because a lot of white workers are very unclear on where they're headed. But I still think it's good. I think because we have a chance now, and we ought to be out there trying to talk to them. Trump just gave us, the Republican Party just gave us a budget. And we have an election coming up in 2018. What I think we need to do is really use this budget, this gift, in order to deepen the level of conversation and struggle like we're having tonight in a much broader way. And not just talk about $12 an hour or $15 an hour, but talk about the whole structure, because this is what people are angry about. And I think the conversations we engage workers around has to be deep, at the level of the crisis that we are facing, which I think is existential. So I'm down for that struggle. But I just want to say it's going to be a struggle. And I don't want to sugarcoat the need for a fight against racism, sexism, and how hard and deep that is. I wasn't just giving pessimistic statistics to be pessimistic. It's kicked our ass. It's kicked our ass. And that's real.
I want to thank the panelists, everybody who spoke tonight, and authors to the Journal, editorial board, and promise you that we will continue to discuss these issues in the Journal. Thank you so much.